Most running shoe brands nowadays have two marathon racing options. One that is maybe a little bit more sleek, can maybe be used at shorter distances as low as the 5K, and then one is typically going to be your elite marathon racing option. With the addition of the Cielo X1 last year, Hoka seems to have joined in on that group as well. Today, we're going to be breaking down the differences between the Hoka Rocket X2 and the Hoka Cielo X1 2.0. What's up everybody, I'm Eric McIntyre, aka Rad Dad Bod, and you're watching Rad Dad Bod TV, where we review running shoes. Now today, like I said, we're going to be breaking down the Rocket X2 versus Cielo X1 2.0. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to be calling them the Rocket and the Cielo. Now, if it's your first time watching one of my videos, you may notice some timestamps below. Feel free to jump around to the various parts of this comparison, but if you do so, sure appreciate it if you come back and watch the full thing when you get a sec, as I put a lot of time and effort into these videos. If you've been a viewer for a while and you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please take a minute, do so now. Turn on notifications even so you get notified every time I drop a new video, which is typically every weekday so far in 2025. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about some disclaimers and disclosures. For the Rocket X2, I did purchase this shoe with my own money from my local running store, but I did get a discount as I have created content for them in the past. For the Cielo X1 2.0, I received this shoe free of charge from Hoka, though I was not paid. I was not giving talking points. I was not asked to make any specific content. All thoughts are entirely my own. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about the intended use of these two shoes. Now the Rocket X line was the original racing line from Hoka. In fact, the Hoka Rocket X1 or Rocket X was one of the first super shoes to hit the market after Nike first introduced the Vaporfly line. Unfortunately, the Rocket X model itself did not perform super well, but with the introduction of the Rocket X2, I felt like Hoka had a legitimate race shoe. Then came the Cielo X1, which was introduced as Hoka's premier racing or marathon racing line. However, despite being a very loved shoe, the Cielo X1 lacked kind of maybe that top tier speed as well as low that a lot of people look for in a racing shoe. Now, the intended use of these two shoes, like I said, is running a marathon, especially with the Rocket X line having been the original marathon racing line from Hoka. I don't think that this is designed to necessarily be like a 5K 2 marathon shoe. No, they're both marathon shoes, but if you run, and especially if you run in super shoes, you go to any local race, even look at the professionals, you know that oftentimes, even at shorter distances, pro runners are choosing the marathon super shoes for those races just because they're so comfortable or so fast. Now, from a price perspective, the Rocket X2 came in at $250 upon release, but I think it's coming up on 2 years old, and so you can normally find it, if you can still find it, on a pretty steep discount. Meanwhile, the Cielo X1 2.0 comes in at $275, and it joins the ranks of those elite priced and elite level marathon racing shoes, which are oftentimes getting closer and closer, if not already at that $300 mark. Now, from a specs perspective, the Rocket X2 actually comes in a little bit lighter at 7.5 ounces and 212 grams. Meanwhile, the Cielo X1 2.0 comes in at 8.1 ounces and 229 grams. But if you ran in the X1 or the original, you know that that is significantly lighter than last year's model and is now a little bit more of a racing weight. Now, from a stack standpoint, the Rocket X2 came in at 37 in the heel, 31 in the forefoot for a 6mm heel to toe drop, and the Cielo comes in at 39 in the heel, 32 in the forefoot for a 6mm heel to toe drop, which is actually pretty untraditional for Hoka, as Hoka tends to be usually actually at that 5mm drop range. From a fit perspective, the Rocket X2, I would say fits true to size lengthwise, maybe a tiny bit short, but for the most part, I would say go with your normal size. As far as width throughout the shoe, we're looking at a fairly roomy heel. We've got an average midfoot and toe box. I wouldn't call them wide, but I wouldn't call them narrow either. Meanwhile, on the Cielo, I would also say true to size lengthwise. I do feel like it fits a little bit longer than the Rocket X2. And then from a width perspective, I would say it's a pretty standard toe box and standard heel, but maybe a little bit more snug in the midfoot, but again, not narrow necessarily. Moving to the uppers, the Rocket X2 had a synthetic mesh or a technical synthetic mesh upper. And this upper was a lot more race-like than the original Cielo X1, which was kind of confusing for a lot of people because you would think that they were going to just continue a little bit of more of this synthetic material for their race uppers. And this is kind of what a lot of people like to see, this or maybe a more like breathable mesh or knit type material, something really lightweight. So it fits the lightweight bill. The shoe, the tongue is fully gusseted, and the shoe is actually fairly hard to get on. It's a little bit interesting. I don't know if it's because of this synthetic material or because that tongue doesn't have a lot of stretch when you have the laces kind of tied down there, but you can get the shoe on and then you're kind of locked in, and it's really nice. It has a very sleek kind of hugs your foot type feel. I didn't experience any chafing or hot spots really, though I did run a half marathon, like a legitimate race in it. And at the end of the race, I was bleeding a little bit on my toe. So at some point my toe was potentially hitting the front of the shoe, but I'll tell you, I did not realize that until I finished the race. But the upper as a whole is incredibly minimal and lightweight. You have maybe a little bit of padding there in the heel, and then the tongue is actually got like, I wouldn't call it full on padding, but the material is really, really nice, smooth, and comfortable. Moving to the upper on the Cielo X1, you have an engineered jacquard mesh, and I thought I knew what that meant, but this is a different material. It's more like a more synthetic material, like on the Rocket X2. And I thought that jacquard mesh was a little bit more cloth-like, and so again, I'll have to look into what that means. Maybe it's a process as opposed to a material, but that is an engineered jacquard mesh according to Hoka. And then you do have a little bit more of a structured heel versus the Rocket X2 was, again, that synthetic material, not really a structured heel, though you did have good heel support and lockdown still in the shoe. You also have this little flare, which is a little thing, but sometimes that can prevent kind of Achilles rubbing or pain, and it just gives you a little bit more structure in the shoe as a whole. Now, this upper is also very, very breathable. However, the tongue is not gusseted at all, which I found to be a little bit strange, but despite that, you get some really good lockdown in the midfoot. And honestly, I feel like the upper kind of just disappears on your foot versus with the Rocket X2, it kind of locks your foot in place, which is nice, but it is a slightly different sensation overall between the two. I think if I had to choose an upper between the two, I might lean Cielo X1. And then you do have much improved laces as the previous model had a little bit of a funky lacing system. Last thing I'll say on the uppers for both of these, I really appreciate that they are a little bit more structured of uppers and they're not really trying to be sock-like necessarily, because I think a lot of racing shoes have tried to go more sock-like nowadays. And for me, a lot of the times that ends up in an overly stretchy or maybe even a baggy upper. And these two uppers are really, really nice in my opinion. Now moving to the midsole, Hoka introduced a PIBA midsole for the Rocket X2, which if I remember correctly was the first time that they used PIBA in a shoe, so it was a really big deal. Previously they were just using pretty much EVA in everything. So you do have that PIBA midsole, you also have the carbon fiber plate which runs through the foam of the shoe, and with the Rocket X2 it created a actually fairly rigid and snappy overall ride. The PIBA construction of the midsole in the Rocket X2 was a little bit firmer than some other models like the Vaporfly or the Alphafly, where that PIBA is a lot more squishy. I feel like they gave it a little bit more structure, and then the base is fairly wide and you have that cutout in the midsole, or I guess technically outsole there. So this shoe was surprisingly stable. In fact, as someone who does have some overpronation issues or has had a history of ankle issues due to playing basketball growing up and then running on trails early when I first started running, I raced a half marathon in these. That was like my A race for that year. And the reason why I chose these shoes was because I could get the speed, the pop, while still getting the stability underfoot. And I'm not a stability shoe runner. Like, that's not what I run in typically, but when you're running that distance and you're trying to go that fast, you do want a little bit more structure. So that was a kind of a pleasant surprise in the shoe. Now, don't get me wrong, it is very much a PIBA midsole. So it is fast, it is responsive, but it's not going to have that squishy overall feeling that you get with a lot of super shoes nowadays. Speaking of squishy midsoles, the PIBA construction in the Cielo X1 2.0, I mean, you can just feel it in your hands right there, especially that top layer, because it is a dual layer PIBA midsole, but it is a lot squishier. And as soon as you put these on foot, you can feel it underfoot. Like the Cielo X1 2.0 is super, super squishy, very much like a lot of the shoes on the market today. A couple other things to note with the midsole: you do have the carbon fiber plate running through, but you do have these wings, which is something that Hoka introduced again last year with the Cielo X1, a winged carbon fiber plate, which is supposed to add a little bit of stability while not sacrificing any of the return. Gives the shoe a little bit more structure. And then the other thing is they did have this cutout here on the medial side of the shoe. On the previous model, it was on the lateral side. Now, I found the Cielo X1 original to be a very stable shoe. It kind of fit the trend of Hoka super shoes being very stable underfoot and being a good versatile option for a lot of people. That's not the case with the 2.0. So I have over 20 miles on the shoe right now. I should have over 30 easy by the end of next week, and I'll do a full review probably sometime next week. The shoe is not just less stable than the original, but it is actively unstable if you are an overpronator. With the cutout right there, as you run, you will collapse inside. So if you are not someone who has really buttoned up running form, strong lower limbs, you will feel that. And I will say that as you speed up in the shoe, it tends to feel a lot more comfortable. And with some of these more advanced super shoes, part of what makes them fast is that they complement a more efficient stride and a faster stride a little bit better. So oftentimes, if you are not running, I would say not that like a 3-hour marathon time is like considered elite by any means, but if you're not running like sub 7-minute pace, then they might not feel as comfortable and they may feel overly unstable, right? So it's not like a, hey, you have to run a certain speed to run in a shoe. More so is, I would guess that they're going to feel more comfortable for people who are running those paces. But any speed you're welcome to try. Today I actually took these out for 10 miles and I ran, 9-minute pace, 8-minute pace. I kind of cut down. We were running low 7s, high 6s at the very end, and the shoe definitely felt more comfortable and actually more stable the faster that I ran. So just something to think about with this shoe versus with the Rocket X2. I mean, other than being a little bit firmer and clearly being like pretty snappy and rigid, like it's not an easy day shoe. It's a racing shoe, but it is more accommodating, I think, to various paces due to the stable midsole underfoot. I do think though that the Cielo X1 2.0, just the tuning of the foam, I think it is faster. At least that's my opinion. It feels faster to me. The other thing to think about here is the shoe has a crazy rocker. It actually is very similar to the Mizuno Wave Rebellion Flash. And yes, that's how you say Mizuno. It is a Japanese last name. I'm half Japanese and live there. But it has a very aggressive rocker to where when you first stand in the shoe, you kind of end up just standing here in the midfoot. And you can see it kind of wobbling back and forth there actually. So there's a big toe spring, but there also is an angle here that isn't quite as obvious, I think, when you see it on screen. But when you put it on foot, it's instantly noticeable. It is kind of almost U-shaped overall, and there is a hinge point there in the forefoot that is pretty far forward, to be honest. I think that is going to contribute to additional instability when running slower. And so I think that's part of why the shoe started to feel a little bit better as you sped up. So something, again, to think about. I do think that this is not going to be as versatile of an option for people. If you have stability needs, I would stay clear away from the shoe, but it's been a very fun shoe to get miles in. Now moving to the outsoles, I really appreciated the outsole on the Rocket X2. It probably added a little bit of weight to the shoe, but living in Utah, oftentimes I'm gonna have wet roads after snow or light rain. And so I want something that can grip the road. And I found that the Rocket X2 had some really strong grip. You kind of had that Durabrasion rubber. It did the job, but it did add a little bit of weight. You can see in the Cielo X1 2.0, you still have some really good outsole coverage there, but I do feel like it is a little bit lighter in construction, so more of the weight is going into the midsole and the shoe itself and less on the actual outsole. You can actually see, maybe on camera, I'm not sure how noticeable it is, but the outsole is much thicker on the Rocket X2. It was snowing a little bit today. The roads were wet today, and so Cielo X1, no issues whatsoever with that traction. I thought it did a phenomenal job. So I'm going to say that these are pretty equal on traction for the most part. Now, as far as my pick, it's tough. I think if I had to run a full marathon in one of them, I would go Rocket X2 because I feel like I would need a little bit more stability assistance as the race went longer and I started to break down. That being said, which do I enjoy running in more? I love the Rocket X2, and I think that I like the Cielo X1 2.0 a little bit better. I feel like this is kind of a hybrid of the Rocket X2 and the Cielo X1 original. So it sits nicely in between the two. You kind of have that more synthetic feeling upper. You have the softer Piba midsole from the Cielo X1 line. You have just a little bit more pop, a little bit more speed or responsiveness to me. But you do sacrifice the stability, right? So I think that this is a good middle ground shoe. If I was running a fast half marathon, I think I would go Cielo X1. If I was going a fast marathon, I think I would go Rocket X2. But honestly, I don't think you could go wrong with either. Personally, I think the Rocket X2 is probably going to be a steal right now if you can find it anywhere because it's a great super shoe. I think it was you know, usually when you hear everyman Supershoe, you think like, oh, so it's like actually not that fast. Like that's kind of the impression that I get when someone says, oh, it's like a Supershoe that everyone can use. That tells me like, hey, maybe there's some limitations with it, but it's accommodating. I think that's great. I do think there should be shoes like that out there. The Rocket X2, I don't feel like you're sacrificing anything by being stable, which is really, really difficult to do. I just think that the cutout of the outsole right there, or the midsole, as well as the overall firmness yet still responsive of the foam, leads to it being inherently stable, which is really, really nice. So it will really come down to usage. I like both of these shoes quite a bit. Now just some final thoughts. I think that Hoka really did a good job with the Cielo X1 2.0. I think that they took the feedback that their pro athletes, as well as many others, had with the Cielo X1, which was a great shoe. I just felt like it was more of a training shoe and less of a racing shoe. And for me, it was primarily because of the weight. I know a lot of people didn't really love the upper as well, but they made some really big upgrades to the shoe. In fact, it's hard to call this the Cielo X1 because so many changes happened. To me, this is more Rocket X3 than it is Cielo X1 2.0, but hey, who knows? Maybe we're still getting a Rocket X3. I can't confirm nor deny. I haven't gotten any information from Hoka on if they're going to continue the Rocket X line. I hope they do, because I think it would be cool to see the two different takes from Hoka. I'm not sure what that will mean, but you know, similar to the Vaporfly and Alphafly with Nike, the Endorphin Pro versus Endorphin Elite from Saucony, I think it's always good to have multiple options at that super shoe level, because everyone's going to have different preferences. Now, if you stuck around this far, I sure appreciate you. Please take a second, like the video, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you get notified every time I drop a new video. And as always, we're going to wrap up with a question, which is your preferred racing line from Hoka? The Rocket line or the Cielo line? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks, everybody.